So I get the chore and the privilege of keeping you guys awake. Men, I'd like for you to consider just for a moment, is it possible that the greatest enemy you're ever going to face is the image in your head of how life's supposed to be? Men, good afternoon. My name is Jim Loggins, and it's truly an honor and a privilege to be with you this afternoon. And it's quite humbling. Many of the men you heard from this morning, as well as you're going to continue to hear from this afternoon, are men that I look up to and admire. So I spent the last 20 or so years working in a variety of business development leadership roles at some of America's greatest companies. And equally rewarding is this long journey I've been on to discover God's purpose and will for my life, not only as a follower of Christ, but as a father, and as a husband, and as a friend. And I've had some successes, and I've had some failures, and today I plan to share a bit more of that with you. So the journey I want to go on with you for the next 15 minutes is I want to first explore this concept of deception and how it actually might be more complicated than you originally thought. I want to read a story of a young boy who grew up in a confusing world and how that shaped the adult he would become. I want to share how I personally relate to the story of the young boy and the life learnings I've had along the way. And then finally, I want to conclude with a game of two truths and one lie. So speaking of, who here has played the game Two Truths and One Lie? I suspect most of you have, or at least know of the game. For those that haven't, let me catch you up real quick. It's a common icebreaker used in corporate settings, a get to know, if you will, to build some connection amongst team members. And the basic premise is that a person would share three statements about themselves, two of which are true and one of which are a lie. And the other team members guess upon that. And so, for example, I might say that I speak two foreign languages fluently. I might say that I have two dogs that I travel with to compete in obedience canine competitions, and that I'm colorblind. And if you have any guesses, come see me afterwards. But seriously, that's it. And as someone who's been in corporate America for well over 20 years, I've played it countless times. And what always strikes me is how believable the lies can seem and how unbelievable the truths can seem. And ironically, I find it more difficult to play with people I know. Meaning, if I know someone reasonably well or think that I do, I find it really difficult to discern what is true and what is a lie. And psychologists have studied this phenomenon quite extensively. And what they've concluded is that deception is rampant in our society, and that sometimes we tell the biggest lies to those that we love the most. Now, if we're being honest, doesn't our life sometimes reflect this? Meaning, don't we go through life wearing masks and living how we're supposed to live? Don't we go through life comparing our reality to the image in our head of how life is supposed to be? Don't we constantly compare our blooper reel to the life's highlight reel? But the better question might be, what if the image in our head, the one that we commonly use as a barometer and a measuring stick of life, is truly what is deceptive? So now I'd like to read a story of a young boy who grew up in a confusing world. And let's look at how this confusion shaped who he would become. So the story begins on the afternoon of July 4th, 1977. With a baby boy being born into a lower-income family outside of Atlanta, Georgia. This would be the family's second child, having a daughter a few years earlier. This baby boy would bear the name of his father, yet there would be some mix-up on his birth certificate and Social Security card, meaning his name would be spelled differently on each document of truth. The boy grew up in a very modest blue-collar home, not much surplus or abundance of amenities, but all basic necessities provided. And by all accounts, the boy's early years were filled with happiness. He began playing sports at an early age and excelled in both athletics and academics. He would eventually graduate high school and go off to college, becoming the first member of his family to ever graduate from college, and only the second member to graduate from high school. This boy would go on to have a considerable career by the world's standards and likely earned more income before age 30 than his parents did collectively during their life. But what is also true is that this boy would face troubles which would lead to confusion, which would lead to questions of what is normal, what is true, what is a lie, would begin to form. A big area of confusion was connected to the presence and impact of addiction in his family. He noticed that his father's drinking would become excessive, and once he was a teenager, he realized he had never seen a day that his father had not drank excessively. He became quite embarrassed during these years when his father would show up for various school and sporting events intoxicated. His older sister, who would begin using drugs and alcohol in high school, would eventually develop a lifelong addiction to drugs. And further, there seemed to be some secrecy over the family tree. With only one living grandparent for most of his life, he was always curious why he didn't have a traditional family of aunts, uncles, cousins, and other grandparents. But any questions to his parents were often redirected or brushed off. And perhaps the biggest part of his confusion, however, was faith. You see, this boy grew up right in the middle of the Bible Belt, where talk of fire and brimstone and God's eternal judgment were more common than please and thank you. Meanwhile, this boy's family rarely, if ever, went to church, despite the density of churches per square mile. However, his family would occasionally talk about God and Jesus, and even had a very large Bible placed at the center of the coffee table in the center of their family room. And while it was impossible not to notice the presence of the Bible in the room, the boy never saw anyone open the book. Because his family never went to church, the boy would notice that every time he would ride by a church, the parking lot was always empty. After all, if it wasn't Sunday morning or Wednesday night student programming, the parking lot was empty. The doors not only closed, but locked. And despite the lack of attendance, this church thing, though, seemed of utmost importance. I mean, God was mentioned in the Pledge of Allegiance at school. There would be churches at every corner. And his high school teammates would always gather before games to mumble through the Lord's Prayer. So a big question would eventually perplex this boy. If this God thing was so important, why was the parking lot always empty? Why was the church always closed? Why was the Bible never opened? Simply, why was the main thing not the main thing? But what is also true about this boy is that he had a neighbor who would perpetually and continuously invite him to church. And there was something about her that seemed different to him. She seemed joyful, kind, gentle, patient, slow to anger. Her smile would speak so many words, and he didn't know why, but there was something about her life that would appeal to him. It just seemed pure and genuine. At age 14, while wrestling with some of these early questions in life and confusion, he said yes to her invitation and found himself sitting in church for the very first time without his parents. There, he encountered a God that pierced his heart and flooded him with presence and truth. Later in life, this boy would frequently talk about his experience and how he never felt alone since that day. He would oftentimes describe an image of a shadow, much larger than him, that always seemed present. Now, interestingly, this boy would not tell anyone about his experience, not even his parents. And once he was old enough to drive, he would begin driving himself to church. And during these early years of formation of his relationship with God, he would hear others refer to Jesus as both Lord and Savior. And he wondered, does the ampersand sign matter? Now, at this point, men, I should probably pause and let you know that if you didn't figure it out already, I was this little boy. Now, I'd like to tell you, after accepting Christ into my life, from 14 through my early 20s, that I lived in a way that was consistent with my overwhelming gratitude for God showing up and becoming real. But what is true is I didn't even know what that looked like. And if I'm being really honest, it seemed no matter what I did or how I lived my life, that shadow, the presence of God, remained present. Now, I won't bore you with the play-by-play, but let me catch you up how the next few years of life played out. I married my wife, Michelle, at 22, and we had our first child at 26. Frankly, we were crushing life, degrees, promotions, new homes, new cars, you name it. Within 2 short years, by the time I'm 28, I had 6 children. Now, you don't have to be a math major to know that something doesn't add up. Now, you see, about the time we became pregnant with our second child, my sister's life had taken a different course that led to a severe battle with drug addiction, unhealthy relationships with men, and 4 children. Each child having a different father, and multiple children, born with an addiction. Through a series of circumstances, my wife, Michelle, and I agreed to initially foster and ultimately adopt my sister's children. In 2 years from that event, my mother would pass away. 2 years later, my father would pass away. At this point, my relationship with my sister completely broken and non-existent. Now, as you might imagine, these events rocked our world and would completely and forever change our course in life. The things we were living for just a few years earlier became irrelevant. To say we were lost would be an understatement. And if you've never tried to love someone battling an addiction, if you've never tried to love a child born with an addiction, never tried to love on children with absent mothers or fathers, all I can tell you is that it is hard. Really, really hard. But something else also happened during this season of life. I was tired, I was weary, I had more questions than answers, so I did the only thing I knew to do. Run back to the shadow that I met at age 14 and see, possibly, would there be strength to be found in the ampersand? You know, Jesus as Savior and Lord. So as I pursued this idea of letting Jesus be the Lord of my life, in a weird and twisted way, I actually found blessings in the heartbreaks and in the disappointments. Now, it's not that we welcome them, but with each one, it seemed there would be a purpose, a reason, a hope. And on the tail end of these storms in my life, I was blessed to work with a coach and a mentor who encouraged me, Jim, write yourself a letter explaining you to you, meaning explore not only what has happened, but how and why it has shaped you. Man, I learned so much about myself during the first half of life, and there are 4 learnings I would like to share with you. 1, I learned the value of being the church versus doing church. With the image of an empty parking lot as a child, I learned why I'm drawn to people who don't get church or didn't grow up in the church. I learned why I'm drawn to people who are broken or hurting. I learned why I'm more interested in what happens outside the church on Monday than inside the church on Sunday. The notion that we are the church, not this building, is incredibly real to me. During my early years of serving men from a local shelter, ironically through this church, when I used to meet at the elementary school, I met a man who said, Jim, our lives may be the only Bible some people read. And I know exactly why I will never forget that man from the shelter that morning, because he spoke truth into my life. As for today, I continue to work with men in men's ministry, but can confidently say I have a true passion for mission work. For the better part of the last 10 years, I've been active in a number of local, domestic, and international missions, and currently have a heart for the people of Haiti. I can only say that if you ever find yourself doing exactly what God has created and designed you to do, you will know. I feel an immense amount of clarity that I am called to be in the mission field. Number 2, identity. I've learned how vulnerable I am to the questions of who am I and whose am I. Identity is huge for me. You see, I formed so much of my identity in my early years based upon the rewards and comments that I would get from my parents. For after all, in their eyes, I had accomplished so much and overcame so much in such a short period of time. Making them proud made me proud. And it led to a bit of codependency that I will probably always battle. As for today, there's tension in my heart. The call that God has placed on my life to be in the mission field is not my family's. So I'm still trying to figure out what that looks like, to love my family, but to pursue my call. Number 3, doubt and accuracy. I've learned how to process my sometimes doubt or misunderstanding of the Bible, as well as working with others who have questions or doubt. As I shared earlier, there are conflicting versions of truth as to who I am or who others say I am. In fact, many years from now, someone could watch this video and dispute who actually stood here to give you this speech. So did Noah really build an ark? Did Jonah really get swallowed by a well? Honestly, I don't know. But what I do know is that Jesus is real, I am real, and the rest are just details. So let's close where we started. A quick game of two truths and one lie. First, the two truths. The view from the mountaintop is great, but the fruit is grown in the valley. Growth comes from battles, men. Adversity is the great fertilizer. We all have a story of brokenness, misfortune, and dealing with life's curveballs. The Bible reminds us that there will be troubles in this world, but we should consider them pure joy. Why? That's where the fruit is grown. Number two, the world is starving for authenticity. As I often tell my children, be yourself, for everyone else is taken. So men, let's lean into our truths. Let's lean into our failures. Let's lean into what's uncomfortable, for that is where the gospel is. Your family, your children, your employees, your church, the unchurched, they're all watching and wondering if you are someone they can relate to. Again, our lives may be the only Bible some people read. And last, the one lie, and it's a big one, men. The image in your head of how it's supposed to be, that's the lie. The image of how our families should be, our marriages, our kids, our careers, our ministries. It's not that I don't believe that God gives us visions or images, but all too often, these images in our head that so strongly and fiercely guide our lives have no biblical foundation. Thank you.